For years, Marvel Cinematic Universe had been the most consistently successful big movie franchise in the world. The movies were not necessarily great, if I'm being completely genuine here, but they did just enough to keep people interested throughout the years. This culminated in 2019 when Avengers Endgame became the second highest grossing movie in the world. However, after 2019, something clearly changed. This massive and seemingly absolutely indestructible film franchise that stood upon the entire movie industry began falling apart financially and started losing its core audience. In 2023, only 1 out of 3 MCU movies was successful at the box office, and it was Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the finale of its own trilogy that has always been more or less disconnected from the main MCU. While the other two made Disney executives very nervous at the very least. The Marvels, the film that was supposed to introduce the X-Men into the Marvel Universe, was a catastrophic bomb and grossed less than its clearly overblown budget, which jeopardized the whole future of the MCU. I am Dr. Onwy, and in this video, let's figure out what made the Marvel Cinematic Universe so popular in the first place, why it collapsed after the Infinity Saga, and can Deadpool and Wolverine actually save this franchise? To better understand the reasons behind the failure of the Multiverse Saga, we need to see why Infinity Saga became this big and was able to keep its audience engaged through 10 years and over 20 movies, which is a lot of time and a lot of content. This should not be underestimated. The movies themselves, as I already stated before, were not necessarily great apart from maybe Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one, and the first Iron Man movie. The MCU movies were very generic superhero films that were mostly corporate driven and not creativity driven. They presented perfectly serviceable, safe, and unpretentious entertainment for mainstream audiences. Marvel was releasing 2 movies per year, and when the franchise gained its steam, the amount of films increased to 3 per year, which is not too much. In fact, 2 or 3 movies per year might just be a perfect amount of content. It's certainly not too much so that everyone was able to follow this film series and not lose the thread of the main story. Another very important factor is that the Infinity Saga was building towards something big, and this something big was obviously Thanos. Everyone knew that whatever characters faced throughout the series, everything would definitely pale in comparison to the confrontation with the big villain. Marvel was very smart to tease Thanos all the way back in 2012 in the post-credit scene of the first Avengers movie. Since then, viewers knew what to look for. They were expecting Thanos, which kept the audience engaged. In this regard, the MCU was very similar to Game of Thrones. By far, the most intriguing part of the show, and the books as well, has always been the big evil beyond the wall. The White Walkers, the Night King, the Army of the Dead. We knew that no matter who wins the war for the Iron Throne, there is always some looming threat in the north, much scarier and much more sinister. I am certainly loving House of the Dragons so far. House of the Dragons is a well-written and well-filmed series with great cinematography. However, it's just a drama about a civil war, a soap opera but with dragons, if you will. That's how I feel, at least. It lacks the excitement of Game of Thrones precisely because there is no big threat hovering over the entire plot and over all the characters. Infinity Saga gave us an extremely satisfying finale, and that's part of the problem. We've been following characters since the first phase, and Endgame is the perfect ending for their arcs. However, the MCU didn't have to end after Thanos' defeat. Since Thanos is not even the strongest threat in Marvel Comics, there was no need to finish the franchise after Infinity Saga. What I think Disney certainly lost is momentum. They certainly had to introduce the next big villain much sooner. And to me, the perfect place for that was the post-credit scene of Spider-Man Far From Home. The movie was released just 2 months after the Endgame and was an actual end of the Phase 3. My personal favorite to be the next big villain was Galactus. I am not a big fan of Marvel comic books, to be true, but I always enjoyed this character and his backstory. But if Marvel chooses Kang instead, that's fine by me. Just introduce him as soon as possible and in the movie, not in a Disney Plus show. You might argue that Thanos was first introduced 4 years after Iron Man, while Kang was introduced to the big screen less than 4 years after Endgame. But the problem is not time, the problem is the amount of content. Yes, MCU got oversaturated with multiple shows of frankly questionable quality. Disney introduced too many new characters and too many plot lines that seem to be completely disconnected from one another. The cohesion between movies and characters that felt before is gone now for the most part. Back in the day, you could easily believe that Thor and Captain America were in the same universe, despite their stories being very different in tone and setting. One is a wannabe space fantasy, another one is a wannabe spy thriller. In these days, however, it's hard to believe that Eternals and Moon Knight have actually something to do with each other. The franchise just got too big, I would even say too obese. The sense of cohesion and certain direction that moved the franchise before was lost. 2.5 years of miscellaneous movies and shows that do not make you feel like this series is even going in one direction. And as a result, the carefully built connection between the series and its target audience was crippled. Not feeling like there is something worth anticipating it, a lot of people just fell out of love with Marvel. And the new audiences aren't really eager to join this bloated franchise. Younger Gen Z, who didn't grow up watching Marvel movies or reading comic books, prefer other forms of entertainment, such as anime, for example. And it's hard to blame them for that. Ultimately, the young audience that could keep the franchise afloat is just not interested in these movies and characters anymore. Besides a lot of homework, the quality of the content, which is an important factor too, is simply not the best. Some shows are just frankly really boring. I watched the first episode of Secret Invasion and was bored to death, even though it was not long. MCU met the fate of Marvel comics. These days they lose in popularity to manga, because comics have become too convoluted and it became really hard to enter the Marvel franchise, while manga is more linear, and it's easy to just pick up a series that you find most interesting and follow this series. For such a huge money-making machine such as Marvel, getting a new fresh audience is always important, but Disney failed it and now Disney is reaping its harvest. One more thing is the availability of Disney Plus. The streaming service is not only expensive to use, but also doesn't work in many countries, so for millions of people it is basically impossible to even legally watch Marvel shows. Now, let's turn to the main question of this video. Will Deadpool and Wolverine save the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Judging by pre-sales of the tickets, it is probably gonna be in top 2 biggest movies of the year. Most likely behind Inside Out 2, but I won't predict now. The bottom line is that the movie in itself will be huge. How will this film affect the whole franchise? Will it give MCU new energy? I'm inclined to say no. The reason why I'm so skeptical is that Deadpool and Wolverine are extremely popular characters, much like Spider-Man. So people will watch Deadpool and Wolverine because of Deadpool and Wolverine, and then they'll come to see another MCU film which involves these characters. But the success of D&W ain't gonna bring more audiences to watch Thunderbolts, for example. Deadpool and Wolverine is the source of huge money here and now, but not a long-term savior. The true test will be next year's Captain America 4, which will show whether people are ready to go further with a new cast of characters. As it stands now, I don't feel like people are eager to watch Brave New World or Thunderbolts. There is just not much interest. There isn't much anticipation from what I can tell. Of course, this is just how I feel at the moment, and I do not claim to possess some advanced knowledge. But it's always fun to speculate and then be completely wrong. Like, I would never have thought that Inside Out 2 would be that huge, especially after recent Pixar box office failures. I am Dr. Onway, and I thank you for staying with me today.